Hi, it's John, and today we're going to take a look at the Nikon 40mm f2 for the Z mount. This review has taken me a while to pull together, as I've struggled to sum up my thoughts about the lens. And I think that people who have used the lens fall into two camps. Many are very positive, especially about the look that the lens renders, while a good number have reservations about the lens. I'll touch on both of these facets. So I'll be honest, I didn't take to the lens when I bought it nearly 2 years back. The 40mm has some appealing characteristics that many people love, but it also has some limitations that ultimately led me to grabbing other lenses when heading out to shoot. But I really like making these videos as it challenges my biases about making a piece of gear. Often I have an initial take on a product which evolves as I spend more time with it. This lens is definitely one of those items where my initial assessment is too simplistic and the reality is more nuanced. I'm going to dive right into the issues I originally had with the lens, and then I'll hopefully provide a balanced take on the lens and provide insight why it has such a loyal following. So it's a small and fast lens, and I thought it would be great for my video shooting and some gimbal work. This was my primary reason for buying the lens. Nikon advertises the lens as featuring a new motor that operates at blazing fast speeds in near silence, which sounds great. But not so much in practice, as the autofocus motor noise is immediately noticeable when shooting video using the camera's internal mics. Here's a quick test of the noise from the autofocus motors using the camera's inbuilt mics. But to be fair, you typically need an external mic if you're recording video in a quiet location, and this lens doesn't buck that requirement. For the street price of $250, I guess I shouldn't complain, as it's not really worse than many of my other lenses. But Nikon's marketing pitch was a little optimistic. And otherwise, it's a nice lens for shooting video, which we'll circle back to later. Okay, so moving on to stills, I ran into my second issue. So a favourite shooting style of mine is taking fairly close-up portraits with the lens wide open. When I tried this with the 40mm, I found I wasn't getting sharp images with my Z6 using IAF with continuous autofocus. And while IAF on the Z6 isn't perfect, it's been pretty usable for some time now. I think close-up shooting is a broader issue with the lens when shooting wide open, and we'll cover this in more detail shortly. But baffled and confused, I threw the lens up onto a shelf and forgot about it for a while. Roll forward a couple of years and I've recently started doing some overhead video work comparing the 40mm f2 with the Z30, which makes a very lightweight setup. And it does a really nice job here. Since I'm not using the camera's mics, the AF noise isn't an issue. So I thought maybe I was being overly harsh about the lens. So I thought I should give the lens another chance, especially given the improvements in the AF performance that my Z8 body has over my now 5-year-old Z6. And in pretty average indoor lighting situations with the lens wide open close up, the results were the same soft, poorly focused efforts. So I thought I'd repeat the test so I could include it in this review video. This time the lighting was pretty bright sunlight with good contrast, and this time the camera nailed focus. The images needed some contrast and sharpening to show details, but the focus was good. Now I've repeated testing in both good and average light, and here's what I think is going on. The lens is known to suffer from spherical aberration, which causes lower contrast at wide apertures and close distances. I don't think it's just a low contrast image issue that we're seeing. I think it's actually that the camera struggles to nail focus on the subject due to the low contrast rendering by the lens. Even though the camera does a good job of tracking the eye, it misses focus close up and wide open. And the less central the subject is in the image, the softer the image becomes, which is a factor for portraits as the eyes tend to be closer to mid-frame than center. I shot some test pictures of the lens at 20 inches and at 14 inches to better understand the impact of spherical aberration. At 20 inches, the corners are soft and sharpen up a bit, stopping down from f2 to f5.6. At 14 inches, the center is soft and the corners are a mess. Here we are at around 20 inches, f2 on the left and f2.8 on the right. The f2.8 center, mid and corners are noticeably sharper than at f2. Now we have f2 on the left and f5.6 on the right. The center at f5.6 is looking pretty sharp even at such a close distance. The mid-frame at f5.6 holds up well, showing plenty of good detail, and blows the f2 image away. The corners are the weakest part of the image, but again at f5.6 the image is decent and trounces the f2 image. Now let's push into around 13.5 inches. This image is on the left, with the image on the right at the previous 20 inches. Both images are at f2. Even before zooming in, the closer image is soft and gets softer away from the center. And as we pull out to the midframe and then to the corners, the close-up image falls apart even when compared to the already soft image at 20 inches. I did one final test to see if the corners were soft due to field curvature. The one on the left is focused in the center, and the one on the right is focused in the corner. In both shots, the corners are very poor. I'm aware that the AF algorithm uses a data feed to the EVF, which is impacted by the choice of picture control. It likes high contrast in both phase detect and contrast detect modes, and a picture control that lowers contrast can have a negative impact on the camera's ability to focus. I did some limited testing by adjusting picture controls, but the results were the same in regular indoor light. But if you feed the camera plenty of light, it can produce some nice sharp images, even wide open close up. Here's an arm's length self-portrait, and the camera does a good hatchet job on my aging skin, showing plenty of details with good focus on the eyes. As part of my research for this video, online forum discussions and reviews often complain that the lens won't focus when close to the subject, and the autofocus is inconsistent. I suspect these folks are running into the same issues I've had. So I think I understand the limitations of the lens and also the different experiences people have with it. If you're not shooting close-up images of people in low contrast environments with the lens wide open, you'll likely not see this shortcoming, and you'll likely enjoy the lens for what it is, smallish and cheapish with decent sharpness and unique rendering. I've compared this behavior with the 50mm f1.8 and the 20mm f2.8, and while they're not infallible, they are consistently and significantly better than the 40mm in the indoor lighting wide open close-up scenario. If anyone has a different take on what I'm seeing, it would be great to hear from them. And if you're finding this video helpful, please comment, like and subscribe. So let's finish up with what is essentially a list of cons before we move on to the pros. Chromatic aberration and coma can be a very visible issue with this lens. I took the Z8 with the 40mm attached and went to the beach with my daughter on a beautiful winter's day. I shot a few photos directly into the sun and was surprised at the amount of colour fringing on highlights. Take a look at this scene. The purple is very evident. You don't need to pixel peep to find it. Here's another example. The sea is an attractive shade of magenta. The image isn't helped by the heavy coma the lens produces around specular highlights when wide open. And here's the sequence starting with the lens wide open and then stopping down. The magenta is very evident wide open, though it's largely disappeared by f5.6 and is essentially eliminated by f11. Just take some care shooting out of focus highlights wide open. As for build quality, the lens is lightly constructed, which my simple brain conflates with poor quality. I think in practice the lens is reasonably well built, but it just doesn't have that solid feeling many of the other Z-mount lenses have. I appreciate that this helps drive down the production cost of the lens, and it's nice to keep it lightweight. While I don't really care about the lack of a metal mount, I miss the satisfaction of handling a robust lens, though this is largely snobbery on my part. And having shot a bunch with the Panasonic 20mm f1.7 on the Micro Four Thirds system, I was hoping for a lower profile pancake lens, but to be fair, I knew this lens wasn't particularly small before I bought it. Other reviewers have mentioned the need to refocus after changing the aperture due to the strong focus shift exhibited by the lens. It's not really an issue for me due to the way I generally shoot, but it's worth being aware of. And finally, I do miss having a manual focus switch on the lens. While it's easy enough to put the camera into manual mode by the press of a custom button or using the eye menu, a manual focus switch right next to the focus ring would help with the ergonomics. So on the plus side, the lens is smallish and lightweight. It's also relatively inexpensive for a Nikon-produced Z lens. These are obviously two of the most compelling features that most of us like in any lens. And while I think the lens could be both smaller and cheaper given its overall performance, there aren't many full-frame Nikon options that can compete here. Taking a look at weather resistance, Nikon describes the weather sealing in the lens as follows. I've not tested the lens in bad weather, but reviews mention that water resistance has been reliable in rain showers. So how does the lens perform for video work? The 40mm focuses fast and confidently in video and has limited focus breathing. Its small size works well on a compact gimbal and is easy to rig up for an overhead shot. Its wide aperture allows for some nice separation between the subject and the background. If you're going to use an external mic, I think you'll find that this is a nice lens for video work. Okay, now we've covered off on the features and limitations of the lens, let's dig into why it has such a following. There are plenty of folks who really like this lens, and it seems to come down to the size, the cost, and the character the lens has. The lens has a good reputation for street shooting, so that's where I took it. And I found it produces nice images in a bunch of circumstances. I visited the Oculus when my lad Dex was at a birthday party down in Tribeca. The Oculus is essentially the station for the World Trade Center. The structure is very cool. I had an hour to kill and only the 40mm with me. I like the challenge of fixed focal length as it forces you to approach the scene differently than if you had a zoom. With this type of structure, I would likely have chosen to go much wider with an ultra-wide-angle lens. But I was forced to look for different styles of images, and it's a good exercise for informing your compositional skills. The 40mm on the Z6 has plenty of detail to allow some cropping to exclude unwanted elements of the scenes. Now here are a few I grabbed on a walk at Carl Schurz's Park on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The official residence of the Mayor of New York City is named Gracie Mansion, and it's located in the park right next to the East River. It was a beautiful bright afternoon to chase some pigeons around. Even attached to my Z8, it was an easy pairing to shoot with. And here's a close-up of a pigeon at f2.5 at 1/1250th of a second and ISO 320, which is remarkably sharp. And out in Connecticut, here are a few pictures from a walk in the woods with Millie and her friend. The rendering of the lens is pleasing to my eye. Next up are some shots from our local neighbourhood on the Upper West Side. We'll start with a few from Riverside Park and the adjacent West Side Highway bike path, and then around the streets nearby. These were shot on a mix of the ZFC and the Z6. And ever since I travelled to New York 30 years ago, I've been meaning to shoot some pictures from Cavalry Cemetery in Queens, which has amazing views of the Manhattan skyline. So I jumped on my scooter and finally made it happen. The lens wasn't a perfect match for the subjects I chose, and the skies were a little too clear to make some compelling images. But here are a few from that swift visit. There's quite a lot of detail captured by the lens, so I was able to heavily crop in to make the images a little more interesting. These are all shot on the Z6. Okay, finally to Coney Island Boardwalk with the Z6. The Z6 is a pretty compact body and makes for an unobtrusive combo when grabbing some quick shots. So how do we conclude on this lens? I struggled to sum up the 40mm given its complexity of character. Most reviews I have consumed are very happy with the lens after weighing up its strengths and its weaknesses within the context of its affordable price. I won't discount these views as folks have different priorities, and it's never as straightforward as good or bad. In search of truth, I took to Google. I found that pretty much every video review on YouTube was overwhelmingly favourable. Perhaps there's a group of folks who only have had the lens for a short time to review it, or maybe there's a lot of confirmation bias. But it's notable that there are so few mentions of the limitation of the 40mm. But when I checked the forums, there was a different balance. Many love the lens and are delighted with its performance and non-digital character for general photography and street shooting. Others are disappointed with it as they struggle to consistently focus the lens close up. And based on my experiences, I think both camps are entitled to those opinions, but their views will be highly dependent on how they shoot. Overall, I find myself wishing for more consistent performance from the 40mm f2. Though I feel as if the lens was sub $200, it would be difficult for me to fault the lens for that price. The 50mm f1.8 is an obvious comparison to make. The 50mm is a better performer across the board, though stopping the 40mm down by a stop or preferably two results in a pleasing level of sharpness. But the 50mm is twice the price and twice the size. Then there's the 24-70 f4, which can be had second-hand for just a bit more than the retail price of the 40mm. It outperforms the 40mm in many areas, with the exception of the wider maximum aperture and size, but overall it's a compelling alternative. I won't be selling the 40mm as it's great for my light overhead video work, and I can totally see using it for outdoor and street scenes when I want to pack lightly. So that wraps up this video. If you have any questions or your own observations about this lens, it would be great to hear your thoughts. Thanks for checking out the video, and if it's been helpful, please like the video, subscribe and leave a comment.